Hello, welcome back. This is the second part of my talk. Unfortunately, there was a Zoom error and I got booted out. So if you're just joining us, this is a part of my talk, Forging Islamic Science for the Kalamazoo Art League. And as I was talking before, there is a sort of epidemic of fake miniatures pretending to depict Islamic science. Created for tourists, but have found their way into various museums and collections, not often, but on occasion. And now I want to talk basically in the second half of my talk about what happens when museums decide to kind of invent objects in general for the purposes of education. And before I get into that, I do want to just briefly talk about, well, what did images of Islamic science in general look like? How many are there? And the reality is that they're just quite rare. I've looked through thousands of manuscripts myself, and in all of those, I've probably seen just a handful of images, and it's even rarer still for scientific manuscripts, mostly because it just was difficult to reproduce illustrations. So here, for example, is probably the most famous illustration of a scientific nature, which is a depiction of the observatory in Istanbul, a short-lived observatory that was built for 4 years to observe for astrological phenomena in the heavens. And what you can see here is a set of scholars at work with instruments, a sort of traditional depiction of science, which is why this piece has been so popular. And this is, I think, often what people expect and want in these sorts of illustrations, and that they're illustrative, that they kind of depict a scene or a moment in history that can then be used. But the reality is this is extremely rare. There's basically almost this and maybe one other or two other pieces that are equally illustrative. And that's why I think so many fakes try to copy from this piece. Also why so many fakes, in a sense, need to be created wholesale, because there's just not that many images out there depicting Islamic science. There's plenty of science. There just wasn't a lot of images because they weren't living in a culture that's obsessed with images in the same way we are today. Instead, if we look at scientific images, what we find are things like this: diagrams, things, circles and some lines. This one depicting the visual system. On occasion, more elaborate ones, diagrams of basically illustrations of this one's an automaton, mechanical automata that I'll be talking about more in a second. On occasion, we also find non-illustrative things, things that are not depicting the scene, or at least in the sense there is a scene in this one, but it's actually a broad allegory. In this case, the defense of alchemy. And what you see here is a variety of different symbols that can be interpreted. What is this? 9 birds flying with a woman looking out the window, 3 men pointing at this Jesus-like figure holding a table of the planets. Now, if you had seen this by yourself, you would never imagine that this is some sort of defense or has anything to do with alchemy. It can only be understood as some sort of allegorical composition. But moving on, what I want to talk about now is essentially what happens when we take this approach to images. That is, images are literal recreations of the science in the past. And this is what people are looking for, right? They want a window into the Islamic past when they buy these fake miniatures or they share them online, right? And what I want to argue is that sometimes we find museums that don't necessarily buy the fakes, but they really stretch the value or the act of museum keeping and historical myth-making to its breaking point by recreating objects based off of images themselves, even images that are not entirely clear if they ever really existed. And this is one museum that I want to talk about. It's the Museum of History of Science and Technology in Islam, which is in Istanbul. If you go to Istanbul, it's just down the road the Topkapi Palace and Archaeological Museum, where you find this medium-sized museum that was built at, it's not a super fancy museum, but it must have taken a couple millions of dollars in order to be built properly. And what you find when you go inside it is this. You find the halls of kind of instruments like these quadrants, these astrolabes. Now, what's interesting about these instruments is that these are all basically recreations. There's actually no historical objects in this museum. But what's even more interesting is that many of these recreations, some of them like this astrolabe is a recreation built of something in another museum. Okay, fine. But this object here is a sort of mechanical automata water clock where it's not actually clear if this was ever built. This doesn't exist anywhere else outside of this museum. It's not even clear if it was ever really meant to be built at all. But they built it and they put it in this museum because museums have to have objects. And so what they've done is they've taken these images like this that I showed previously, and essentially kind of recreated them with modern techniques. The same thing we can see here with this elaborate water clock. But they've done this for other things. They've created all sorts of chemistry objects like these beakers, this flamethrower, apparently. Even if we look here, we have medical instruments. Now, this is odd because actually there's quite a bit of medical instruments remaining. But rather than collect those actual historical artifacts, they've decided to recreate these medical instruments themselves. So the guy behind this museum and this collection is a man named Fuad Sezgin, who recently passed away. He's a very important historian of science at the University of Frankfurt. And the whole point of this work is to sort of demonstrate the kind of hidden renaissance, the hidden intellect of science in the Islamic world. And he thought that the best way to do this is that rather than highlight actual historical pieces, is to kind of create things that best embody that spirit of science in Islam. And there's similar things. There's a whole new museum dedicated to the works of Al-Jazari, the guy who built these, planned out these sort of water clocks and showing you. So one question I have here is that what's the harm? How is this connected to my previous discussion about fake miracles? Is there any connection? Is there any harm in these museums building together these materials? And on one hand, I would say no, because I think recreating objects is very much part of the methodology of history of science. And historians of science use this all the time. They recreate things like old brewery equipment in the 19th century England to understand how people started tackling ideas of thermodynamics at that period. Otherwise, we get all sorts of other things, other ways of doing this. And in fact, we see this in other museums too. For example, the History of Science Museum in Milan has also recreated objects that never actually existed. In this case, the objects of Leonardo da Vinci, trying to showcase his genius by essentially creating little models of some of his flying contraptions. So again, none of these actually objects exist or supposedly work, but they're taken from his drawings and then sort of recreated by modern hand. You can see this from the 1939 edition that was initially accompanied these recreations. Now, what's actually interesting is that this whole project of recreating Leonardo da Vinci's mechanisms comes from a sort of similar enterprise, which is to demonstrate the attachment of the Italian nation under the fascist dictator Mussolini with science. So as Mussolini is trying to project an image of scientific virtuosity in Italian industry, he is doing it by kind of co-opting the image of Leonardo da Vinci. And to do so, he created an entire exhibit, an entire hall, where he put the kind of recreations of Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines next to modern Italian military equipment, airplanes, and so forth, trying to create a sort of connection between them. So here we have sort of a weird gun apparatus created by Leonardo, or imagined by Leonardo da Vinci, and here's the modern machine gun for the army. What's really, again, the harm of all this? Well, one, I would argue that I think it's ultimately a question of resources that in the end, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars are invested in these museums, but what's not being invested in is actually collecting the actual historical artifacts, the remnants of the Islamic scientific past itself. And instead, people are investing a lot of money in essentially creating objects that seem to embody the image of science that we actually want from the Islamic past. We treat objects and images as sort of emblematic rather than as necessarily historical. And then ultimately, these objects are sort of meant not to cause greater inquiry, but just sort of to inspire wonder. Now, what is wonder? Let me actually give you a definition from what wonder meant in the medieval period. There was an entire genre called the wonders of creation. And in this, they would list all sorts of wondrous things that a person could see in either foreign geographies, but this could be a whole source of things. You can have monstrous animals like this, but also this sort of plate. This is a lusterware ceramic plate that, because of the way the light shone on it, created a sense of bewilderment because it wasn't clear what was causing this visual effect. And this was what they defined as wonder. And here, ultimately, we have wonder at work too. And I think all museums aim to establish wonder. And this is what we have both in the fake miniatures and the recreated objects. But the wonder isn't there to make us inquire into the history of Islam or things like that. The wonder is just there to show that, Muslims have science, Muslims are rational. But one of the things I argue is that this is should be our starting point. That there doesn't need to, let's say, show this particular moment or point in the museum, that the museum should naturally bring this out, not by reimagining or recreating objects, not to spin a narrative and then create objects to make it real, but by collecting those objects, historical objects in reality, and basically narrating something together like that. So what's to be done? Here, I just want to step back, and I'm inspired a bit by Anthony Grafton, who's a scholar of the Renaissance. And he says that ultimately the forger and the critic, they're two roles that do basically the same thing. They make the past relevant to the present. But the difference is that the forger is irresponsible. However good his ends and elegant his techniques, he lies. And it seems inevitable then that a culture that tolerates forgery will debase its own intellectual currency, sometimes past redemption. So I think there's some truth to what's being said here, is that when we create objects to make the Islamic past relevant to our present, we do so in a manner that's forgery or very similar to forgery. I think we're ultimately watering down that past in the heritage and what we can learn from it. At the same time, it's not really clear who's exactly responsible for all this. Is it the museums themselves? Is it us for being gullible enough to believe it? And in the end, don't all museums really require some sort of constructive imagination? And as a sort of final place to think about is that if you go a bit further, there's another museum, or if you go a bit further in Istanbul, a bit further past the Museum of History of Science, there's another museum of invented objects. And that museum is the Museum of Innocence. Museum of Innocence is actually also a novel. And both the museum, the building, and the novel are in sense products of Orhan Pamuk, a Nobel Prize-winning author. And if you go through this museum, you get through these dioramas, and you have to listen on the headphones, and the headphones basically, you press the number as you go through, and it tells you a story. Now, that story is the story of the novel, but it's really unclear as you're going through that what came first. Did Orhan Pamuk collect those objects and then decide to write a story? Or did he write the story and then kind of create the objects that needed to go with them? And ultimately, I think what the whole point of his museum is that this is, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. That we're always both finding objects and telling a story about them. We're also, creating a narrative and then finding objects to fit that narrative, or creating objects. And what I like about Orhan Pamuk's museum is that it's sort of ultimately, I think, a much more intellectually honest approach, because this is what museums do, that they inevitably kind of create some sort of, we can't know everything about the past. They have to use some sort of imagination to bring these people, these cultures, these objects to life. Otherwise, it's just a place full of objects. It has no story behind it. But we don't want to go too far in which the story that we want to tell, in this case about how science is, how Islam has science and is rational, which is true, of course, but we don't need to make up the objects to tell that story. Instead, we need to use the objects that historically exist to help tell that story. So if you want to know more about what I've been talking about, you can read kind of the longer article that inspired it. It's called Forging Islamic Science. It was in Aeon a few years ago. It's online. Just type my name and the title in. And this was then syndicated in American Scientist, though without the last part. So thank you again. I really appreciated being invited to speak to the Kalamazoo Art League. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just Google my name and email me. I'm happy to speak to you, discuss this further. Thank you.